It is a design to get the value of your work into a piece of paper and get the real value of it into their pockets by allowing them to exchange that same kind of paper for real assets. And so, in effect, when they run the value of that piece of paper to less and less trust, lower and lower trust, lower and lower value, it finally winds up that all of the work that's been done this last 100 years, 100 plus now, more or less winds up in their pockets or in the world someplace owned by them, whether it's real estate or gold or whatever else it is. And the people who worked for it wind up penniless and in a position of being controlled by military forces that are paid for by gold and the assets that the rulers have.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance and Reluctant Preppers. We have a distinguished returning guest tonight. Wayne Jett is the author of Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now. He joins us here again to talk about some serious developments that are happening in our country that are going to affect all of us. Wayne, thanks for joining us again here on Liberty and Finance.
Good to see you again. I'm very happy to be here.
We've been having some communication challenges over the past quarter or so, and many missed opportunities to have you back on some very pointed topics, but we've got you back now, so let's make some hay while we can.
Great, thanks.
The first topic we'd like to get you to weigh in on is, I guess I'm going to call it the fox in the henhouse with our nest eggs, which is about how the Fed is failing as a bank regulator. If you can talk to us about just the high points on what was supposed to keep the major banks from having basically a stranglehold on our financial lives, what changed recently to kind of break that game open, and where it's leading to unless these things change. Can you give us an understanding of that?
Yes, well, I think the listeners will, of course, remember Dodd-Frank, passed in 2010. That was the so-called financial reform bill from the Senate and the House, Congress, and Obama and so forth. It was going to clear up all the problems that resulted in the blow-up of 2008. One of the things they slipped into that bill, there are many things to object about, but the major thing that they did was that all of a sudden they made the Federal Reserve the only regulator of the banks in this country. And with the federal regulation completely done now by one body rather than having at least two different bodies regulating before, we come up with a situation in which we have a Federal Reserve, which, if people don't understand, the Federal Reserve's corporate stock is owned by banks in accordance to the amount of their assets and proportion to those. And so it really means that majority control of the Federal Reserve through their corporate stock is owned by the big banks of Wall Street. So in effect, we have the Federal Reserve owned and controlled and managed and really got them by the throat. The Fed is really operated completely through the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The open market desk there does all of the open market trading, all transactions. And so really Wall Street operates the Fed. And here we have the Fed regulating Wall Street. And so, of course, what could go wrong? Fox in the henhouse is a good way to put it. But what has happened since 2010, since Dodd-Frank went into effect? First, you remember we saw hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of liability being assumed by the big banks on interest rate derivatives, they call them. I don't know what has happened. Those have faded off the headlines, we'll say, of the attention that's given on the web. And it's moved into another type of transaction. As far as I'm aware, I don't see any reason why the interest rate derivatives would be any smaller than they were in the hundreds of trillions. And most likely, with interest rates going even lower, they would be even more amazingly large in terms of total liability. Now, as listeners remember too, in the late 90s, the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed, which basically had required banks to keep their bank account deposits separate and completely apart from no liability mixed in with their investment banking.
Right.
Glass-Steagall repeal removed that, and so now bank deposits are completely subject to being taken by investment losses. And so we have these trillions of dollars worth of investment risks that have been accepted by the big banks. That's subject to wiping out. Certainly, FDIC would be completely meaningless, and therefore you would have another political jam in which Congress is expected to bail out the big banks from whatever their financial situation really is. And Congress would do it because otherwise all of its constituents who have deposits in those banks would be wiped out. So that is a major problem that really needs to be rectified. Obviously, it's not going to happen with Nancy Pelosi running the House. I don't think they're going to be interested in helping us out in that regard, but maybe I'm wrong. Nevertheless, there's no discussion of it, and so there's that problem.
So let me just make sure I got the two main points that I'm hearing so far. One is that this fox in the henhouse is that the banks run the Fed, and the Fed is the sole regulator of the bank. So basically, we've got the ultimate good old boys club where we just basically it's all on the honor system now, and the banks can really do whatever they please in that way. Secondly, that it's our eggs that are in the henhouse, our nest eggs, our hard-earned savings and deposits. Anybody who's got deposits in the bank, now those deposits are vulnerable and subject to whatever shenanigans the banks want to be playing on their risky derivative leveraged investments or bets or swaps or whatever on the backside that are orders of magnitude greater, and now our deposits are basically subject to bail in or whatever to help bail out the banks if they get in trouble again, or if they say, to the Congress, we messed this up maybe, but you need to bail us out because otherwise look at the poor people that are going to be affected by this.
Yeah. And one more thing I'd add is that it's not just the big banks that would be depositors subject to risk. It would be the small ones too. As soon as one big bank goes down, FDIC is blown away. And so nobody else has any protection. And you can bet that there would be all kinds of problems for all depositors in this circumstance. So that is one of the things that really needs attention. Not the only thing, but it's a good place to start.
Well, on that point, before we leave that makes the ordinary person be extremely vulnerable, extremely exposed. Not only might this be a systemic contagion that could wipe out our entire financial edifice, but it leaves each individual saver very overexposed. So it kind of seems to draw the focus on that we need to take care of ourselves because, as you point out, we can't wait for the political leaders to do that for us.
Well, hopefully, as I've said some in the past, I'm looking toward a financial reform of a major nature, including ending the Fed and reforming the dollar to be real money. Now, that is I'm talking about gold-backed currency. And so those things, I think, are still in the offing, likely not to be done in an election year, I would think. But you have to do those things when, at least at the latest, when it's demanded that they be done. That is, that there's a failure of currency, and you just have to do something in order to solve the problem that we definitely have. And with as much money as being put out through repurchase agreements,
right,
orders of magnitude, tens of times as much as we were being put out in the first decade of the 21st century. That's certainly the case of what is going on now. So I think we're in the latter stages of the existence of our fiat dollar, or the so-called Federal Reserve note, a promissory note that has no assets behind it to back it up. So it is a problem that is getting more severe. I've said a number of times before that I think the economic program, more or less behind the scenes by the Trump administration, is to go to a sound currency and to end the Fed. But nevertheless, in the meantime, we have these festering problems that the cabal that owns the banks, the globalist cabal, the big banks, are creating these problems, I think, in order to be able to lower a crisis upon us at the time of their choosing. But at least we have, I think, an administration now that is trying to be ready to do something about it and help.
In addition to hoping that the administration will do something about it, what are some examples of things that an ordinary individual should consider doing to lower their exposure to this unacceptable risk posed by this sort of fox in the hen house watching over our nest eggs?
Well, it's a hard thing for me to cover all kinds of different exposures and risks that other people take or have in their own operations. For individuals, they might take a look at credit unions, maybe have a different level of liability or exposure as they would in the banking system that is covered by FDIC. But I'll have to, I think, kind of summarize that because I know we have limited time. It's possible to buy gold still. It's possible to buy silver still. I mean, you have to look at the kind of circumstances of your own capability of managing your affairs. If you take possession of those kind of things, you need to be able to be sure of their security and be able to use them in a way that is financially advantageous to you. So best of luck on that. It's a complex subject that I think others would be better able to describe than I would. But at least that is in the nature of something that preserves intrinsic value rather than simply a paper promise that has no assets back that have the capability of performing the promise. So that, I think, would summarize it as far as I can go right now.
Speaking of a contract that fails to perform and how things can change suddenly, my wife and I were watching the evening news at bedtime last night. Our local franchise of a national restaurant chain in our town went out of business with no notice to the employees or the customers or anybody. It shuttered its doors yesterday. We had purchased a sizable gift card at Christmas time because they had a really special deal. You buy this, you get an add-on bonus card and so on. We loaded up, and overnight that card went from having what we perceived to be significant value to having zero value, because now that contract we had with them has no ability to perform. And as Bill Holter and Jim Sinclair say, what's the value of a contract that can't perform is zero. So what we considered currency, that gift card that has a number of 3 digits and more written on there in terms of its value, is now basically of no value. And that can happen without notice overnight and makes.
So they offered that wonderful card to get some money in the door, and then they closed the door.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
You also wrote recently about something called the Harvard Law Plots. That sounds like a intriguing spy novel. And when you were telling me about it before we started recording, it was starting to really get my ire up. Could you talk to us about what that is, what it signifies, and why we need to be paying close attention?
Well, the Harvard Law Review, of course, is the law review of the Harvard Law School, which considers itself to be the most prestigious and capable in the country. We see people from Harvard Law on television all the time telling us all about the law. Harvard Law Review, like any law review of any university law school, is a serious place. Only the top students get to be on the board of editors to get to have a chance to write on it. I wasn't on law review. The top students in our class were very good people. They write on serious subjects and they try to be help to the bar and so forth and so on. So this is not a cartoon shop. And at Harvard, since they consider themselves the top of the top, it's definitely a serious matter. On January 10th of this year, they published a law note, which is something ordinarily worked on by the Board of Editors and supervised by professors with professional expertise in that area, came out with something that basically addressed the Constitution and what they say was a basic unfairness in our Constitution, that the premise of fairness among all people should be that all are created equal. They got it from the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, right, not from the Constitution. And they basically wipe away all the work that was done at the Constitutional Convention and say this has got to be brought to be the overriding premise completely in the Constitution now. And there's such an unfairness in the way they represent the people now that we must use some, even if we have to get it right, we have to be unfair in the way we treat this. And so we're not going to pay attention. Let's see if we can find a way around Amendment 5 that has this unfair requirement that 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states have to approve any amendment to the Constitution. So they say, what we can do is this. We can have just a vote of the House and the Senate. They don't even mention a signature by the president. The House and the Senate can vote by majority vote, and we can make an amendment that will let us get in a position that we can do everything else we need to do. What would that amendment be? They say, we will divide the District of Columbia, its present 10 by 10 miles square. We'll take only the central buildings of the government, and everything else we'll carve out into 127 different neighborhoods which have already been identified. And we will make each one of those neighborhoods a state. Give it 2 senators and 1 congressman. We'll have control of both houses, and we will immediately adopt, by majority vote of House and Senate that we admit those states. Then we admit all those other people, and we'll do what else we need to do then. And the first will be an amendment that takes all power away from the Senate and gives it to a different body. We don't know what that body is, but it'll be a different body, and they will tell us later. The next thing we'll do is we'll remove the Electoral College. So it's a direct vote for the president. And we know what happens with the Electoral College was put in my estimation, to prevent one fraudulent state from stealing the entire national election by just manufacturing as many votes as it possibly can, or a combination of states doing the same thing. So it's a very vital mechanism to prevent fraud in national elections, especially the presidential election. And they have some other things that they're going to throw in. But that, in summary, is a way in which they would completely wipe away the rights of the states to approve any amendment, the rights of the Senate or the House to approve it in the way it is now, because those 127 new states obviously would give them complete control of both the House and the Senate. And so in the circumstances, they say this would be really fair because those districts, those 127 districts, neighborhoods in the District of Columbia, in the last presidential election and in the elections before that, every one of them voted Democrat. They say that's a good reason we can depend on them giving fair representation to the rest of the country. So you can see the kind of sophistry that is thrown in your face with this thing. And so you say, boy, this has got to be a joke. No, it's not a joke. I'll tell you, in my opinion, the kind of thing that it might serve as a purpose. If you were raising money, for example, you have a document called a prospectus. Or if you have a campaign for president or something of that sort, you have a sales pitch. It seems to me that this law note being put out there by the Harvard Law Review is the kind of thing that could help someone or some group raise money. For example, a few $1 billion, say, to make sure that they have the House and the Senate for one brief shining moment, to be able to put this into account. So it would be a ready-made sales pitch to make such a fundraising effort. And of course, how in the world would they put it in a prestigious law review other than to give it some aspect of respectability so that it is not regarded as a plot to overthrow our Constitution, to remake it again from anew so that our Bill of Rights, for example, omits the things, after all, when they can amend the Constitution with a majority vote and then take over, they can amend every amendment, including our Bill of Rights. So it is a consideration that if I made this up myself and said they might do something like this, it would be preposterous. But I can't help but take it seriously when it is put out in what is regarded in some quarters as the so-called preeminent institution of legal education and leadership in the country. So I'll pause there and see what you have to say, Donovan.
Well, just wondering if there's any defense against that other than just getting the word out so that people can stand up against such a rash and radical abandonment of the virtues of our Constitution and the tradition that surrounds it.
Well, I decided to write about it myself to call attention to it on my website, classicalcapital.com, thinking that, my goodness, if I were in law enforcement, it seems like I might want to look into that. If I had responsibilities for protecting against attempts to undo or undercut our Constitution, it seems to me that our justice system ought to function in some way and to do an investigation to see whether these kind of things are actually being, I have to say that a law note is a serious undertaking. In my estimation, it always has been in my experience, and that's enough to convince me that it's something that ought to be looked into and considered as to what efforts are being made to make it happen.
We certainly heard in the last presidential election of 2016 this cry for a revisiting of the whole Electoral College and the cry for let's change the whole system to be by popular vote. Do you see this as a natural outgrowth of that same philosophy?
Well, it's an indication to me of desperation that there are people who think they cannot win at the ballot box the way it is, and therefore they must undercut the Constitution before gaining power, or gain power in an illicit way, is what I would term it as being, in order to suggest anything of the sort. I'm amazed with this law note being clearly in the public domain. Why has none of the Harvard law authorities on constitutional law, why have they not been asked about this? Why did you put this in your law review? What do you think about it? What's to be done to stop this? What's to be argued as the basis for regarding this as anything other than subterfuge to undo the fundamental protections of our Constitution. Those seem to me to be subjects that ought to have made it on the evening news the day it was published. And here we are almost 2 months later, and I'm not sure I've seen it mentioned other than on the internet with individuals seeking to call some attention to it. So there we are. We have plenty of things on our minds these days, yes. And it could very well be that some of these other national catastrophes or international crises or things like that have been brought up in order to give some cover to this particular item. I don't know. I don't have evidence to prove that or to suggest it, but it certainly occurs to me that sometimes there's a look over here type of activity in order to prevent attention from being given to something of this nature. I'm still astonished that it would be actually published in English in such a prominent publication.
We'll try to provide a link to that document in the notes underneath this video so that people can look at that themselves and draw their own conclusions and spread the word. You also wrote back just before the end of the year about don't cry for the Fed, send it to oblivion. And in that, you raised some themes about the inappropriateness of the fruits of people's earnings being put in the hands of those who do not have their own do not have the interests of the savers at heart. It reminded me of the concerns raised by a recent guest of ours, John Adams, the economist from Australia, objecting to a cash ban on large transactions that's being worked through the Australian Parliament, before which he has testified on why this is a terrible idea, taking liberties away from people to do as they choose with their money, and discriminating against businesses that make a significant portion of their living through cash transactions, that sort of thing. Can you tell us what was the gist of your critique of the very existence and function of the Fed as far as being inappropriate stewards of the banks who are not being good stewards of people's funds?
Well, essentially, I think the thrust of that article, that's been some time ago, but essentially you're talking about the whole problem with fiat currency, and that is taking a paper promise to deliver something of value. People get completely the wrong idea, especially Americans got the wrong idea of what was involved in the tremendously important change from a gold-backed dollar, in which if you got $1 or a $10 or a $20, you could take it to the bank right then and get a piece of gold for it, a gold coin, at a stated guaranteed rate. That puts your labor in your pocket, the actual value of it, as opposed to having a piece of paper that someday, sometime they'll pay you something, but we can't really tell you what. Once they made that jump, they were able to cut the life of the gold-backed dollar to 20 years. From 1913 to 1933, the gold-backed dollar ended as far as Americans were concerned. Some people say, well, it was 71, 72. But actually, Americans weren't able to change their dollars for gold anytime after March, April of 33. And the gold they already had to be turned in. So the point being that in Argentina or any other fiat currency bank, it is a design to get the value of your work into a piece of paper and get the real value of it into their pockets by allowing them to exchange that same kind of paper for real assets. And so, in effect, when they run the value of that piece of paper to less and less trust, lower and lower trust, lower and lower value, it finally winds up that all of the work that's been done this last 100 years, 100 plus now, more or less winds up in their pockets or in the world someplace owned by them, whether it's real estate or gold or whatever else it is. And the people who worked for it wind up penniless and in a position of being controlled by military forces that are paid for by gold and the assets that the rulers have. So that's the kind of problem we're facing now. I'm not trying to bring gloom and doom. I'm highly optimistic that we have a better chance right now than we've had in my entire lifetime and long before that to actually overturn these people. That's what the commotion is all about in Washington, D.C. right now, and why they're trying to get rid of this president and the people who back him, because we're in the process, despite the naysayers who say, no, he's just one of them. We have the first real battle in my lifetime in which there is a counter-assault to go after these people who've put in plain English since 1901 that their intention is to wipe us all out and to create a two-class society. Only themselves and their slaves or their servants. There's some very current stuff that's very, very pertinent to all this that I saw just on the internet last night and today, a very poignant discussion of the subject of Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger and the taking of black lives. And this whole thing, there's been a discussion about how black people could vote for this man and so forth, when this man who's in the presidency presently is entirely against abortion, is entirely against the taking of lives. And the figures show that since abortion and Planned Parenthood came into existence, something like 47% of the black population that would have been born has been aborted. That is something that serious people in the black community are fully aware of and are discussing on a lively basis right now. And they presently have a president who is very much on their side and getting rid of this abortion mill situation that affects not only black children, black babies, but whites and of every color, of course, every one of them being precious. And yet Margaret Sanger was on the arm of the man who wrote the 1901 plan as they went in as the honored guests at the White House of President Theodore Roosevelt in 1902 or thereabouts. Because he was the honored guest, H.G. Wells, because he had written this book spelling out the plan of how they were going to wipe out the middle class entirely and, in effect, come to global rule of the people they wanted left, exterminating the rest. And we're right at just more or less H hour. They were talking about by 2000, they planned fervently to be able to poison us all that they did not want. So that's where we are, and we're in a situation of actually having a counterattack mounted, I fully believe. And so I think it's a time for everyone to be as well informed as possible and to do as much as you can in the way you think best to help things. That is, to make our Constitution work for us and get it back to the position that it should have been before so much subversion has taken place, including having sound money. I think we have a presidency that is devoted to that, although I can understand why some people are still maybe late in getting to understanding these things. I would certainly invite them, please inform yourself fully. I think the book that does it best is The Fruits of Graft, published back in 2011, before we had this bright, shining light leading us right now. And it didn't look nearly as bright then. But we've had tremendous progress already in the last 3 years. And I'm thinking we're going to have more of it in the next one or two.
Help us understand how our current president is assisting in that, specifically because you mentioned about you believe he's a sound money advocate and that sort of thing, and yet he's calling very, very publicly, even as recently as last night. Today is, I should have said this in the beginning, today is Wednesday, March 4th, 2020, but even at a rally last night, President Trump was praising the step of rate cutting by the Fed and saying we need more rate cuts, we need lower interest rates, more basically expansion of easing of availability of money supply and that sort of thing. It sounds like he's beating the drum for devaluation, debasement of the U.S. currency, flooding, trying to solve the debt problem with more debt. So how is that helping to bring us back to sound money?
I think that's a short-term tactic on his part, and it is you have to get the currency reset. All signals go before you can make it happen. If your currency crashes when you're not ready to replace it in a hurry with a sound monetary system, then you have a problem of the nature that occurred in Germany in the 1920s. Very long and very unpleasant. Lots of starving, lots of absence of food on the shelves, and so forth and so on. In order to avoid that, you need to have the new system ready to go, and that needs planning. It also needs assets to back it. It also needs coordination with other major nations, especially trading partners. The ones who are dissatisfied with your currency already and want to go to such a system. Yes, the last 3 years have been taken up in great part, at least, as public attention by attacks on the president to get him out of office, trying to divert him from taking care of those kind of things. But we have made more progress in these last 3 years than ever in my lifetime to try to get back to a very much needed current account balance. In our national trade, we must sell as much as we buy from foreign nations. We must sell as much to them. Therefore, a balanced current account in order to have a sound currency. Otherwise, every year we have to ship out assets to them in payment, and our assets will be gone. We've been avoiding that terrible imbalance in this recent design because the money we send them every year, $850 billion before this administration started per year. That money comes back in and buys assets here. So the foreign countries are owning America already.
Right.
But there is a solution to this. I think the economic policy that President Trump has been putting into place to redo the trade agreements, to put in the tariffs until we get fair agreements back into place. Those are the kind of things that are necessary to get a current account balanced, and then you can go to a sound currency, presuming that you have gold assets to back it up. And there are some reasons to believe, although I don't have the evidence or proof of it, that there certainly has been attention given to what happened to our gold, where is our gold, how much do we have, and whether we have it already. I'm thinking that we're getting into a better position to do that, but still at this point, he is doing the backing and filling to say, don't crash the economy now. We need to go ahead and get our current account balanced before the Fed does its thing again, because definitely the Fed has been on previous crashes very much involved. It was not the laboring oar in the crash of 1929, but it was the laboring oar in 2000, the tech crash, and it was the laboring oar again, or at least it was one of the main ones in the 2008 financial terrorism. They were certainly in on both of those. Yes, I can understand people being concerned about the president talking up cheap money, but it's a matter of keeping the plates spinning before they come crashing down. We don't want to do it at the inopportune time when he's ready for it to be done. I'm convinced he's on the path to ending the Fed. and putting our money back into a system that so many Americans understood and appreciated back in the 19th century before they became dumbed down on it. We had many very good people opposing the creation of the Fed in 1913 and even afterward. But unfortunately, the globalist powers had their foot in the door, and they've been gaining ground on us ever since.
Well, it's a provocative thesis that you're advancing there, that Trump is having to keep the plate spinning while he prepares behind the scenes for a complete rework of our financial system, because on the surface it certainly looks to the ordinary observer that he's beating the drum just the same way that Obama did, or anybody prior to him, as far as increasing the debt, profligate spending, and weakening the dollar. So that's a tough.
Let me just add one more thing about it. Yes, he's also spending on military, but at the same time he's bringing troops home. The military spending could very likely be required, non-optional, because of the very real prospect that with the people trying to overthrow our Constitution, military forces could be brought into the United States in the state that our military was in, that he describes as being out of spare parts, out of airplanes, out of this and out of that, and with debilitated even manpower. It's not out of the realm of possibility that other countries could actually invade here if we're not strong. I think that's really behind the military buildup, although some deride it as merely just a matter of feeding the military-industrial complex again. It's very important as to who controls that and for what purposes it's used. And I'm still encouraged by the fact that he is preventing wars and moving toward bringing people home, although there's certainly some war hawks that are still trying to pursue the same plans that were involved in the last since 1988, really.
Well, Wayne, it's been eye-opening as always, and we've just pricked open 2 or 3 major topics that people are going to be energized to follow up on. We'll try to provide links both to your articles that dealt with these topics as well as any source documents that people can look into. We've been speaking with Wayne Jett, author of The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now. There's a copy of the book. And how can people access that book if they want to find it?
It's on my website, classicalcapital.com. classicalcapital.com, and it's $25 for the hardback with free shipping inside the United States. And it will tell you the truth about the Great Depression, how it was an imposed genocide imposed by the highest levels of the United States government and under the control and to suit the wishes of the same globalist cabal that is still after us today. But so far, they don't have us. And
we'll put links to the earlier episodes that we had where we interviewed you, and basically era by era through the last century and a half that you walked us through in that book, and so that people can understand the importance of what you're describing. It's just mind-blowing. It changes your whole view of history and of our relationship to our own government and what we need to do going forward.
It changed mine when I learned those things and had to write it. And so I very much appreciate your audience, Dunnigan, and I thank you for having me on again. Trying to get the word out to people when just about any other book that suits the major mainstream press is on TV all the time. It's good to get a chance to present my book to the attention of people who could make good use of it. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, and we are having to break free and be independent of those mainstream, so-called mainstream forces, because every time we break open an actual meaningful topic that people really need to be educated about, we get flagged as under review and demonetized on YouTube by Google. So, folks, to help us remain independent, if you believe in this kind of expose and the kind of truth-seeking that our guests bring out here. In the description of this video, you will find a link to how you can support us at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers or paypal.me/reluctantpreppers. So, Wayne Jett, author of Fruits of Graft, thanks for joining us here again on Liberty and Finance.
Glad to be here, Donegan. Thanks.
Hey everyone, since I started this channel over 6 years ago, my mission has not changed. It was then and is now to help as many people as possible to take care of our families and protect ourselves from the undue risks that we're facing from our fiat financial system, the banks, the Fed, and now the tumbling stock markets. If you've decided that now is time for you to take action by obtaining real money, physical precious metals for your family, I can now fulfill my mission in a new way because I've established a relationship with Miles Franklin, one of the oldest and most trusted names in precious metals in the United States. Over 30 years, family-owned, rated A+ by the Better Business Bureau, with 0 customer complaints over their 30 years of service. If you've decided that now is the time to take action and to acquire physical precious metals, just email me at libertyandfinance@gmail.com. I'll get you connected with the right licensed and bonded dedicated agents who can help you acquire the physical precious metals that you need to protect your family's finances. Again, email me at libertyandfinance@gmail.com. I'm confident that together we can take better care of our family's financial futures.
Reluctant Preppers provides educational awareness and commentary only. Opinions expressed do not constitute personalized financial advice. Viewers are encouraged to do their own research and seek qualified personal financial consultation before making investment decisions.